So you've started weathering your models and you're having fun with it and you're liking the way it looks. Maybe it's time to kick it up a notch. Hey, I'm John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. A few weeks ago, I released a video where I talked about getting started in weathering. I quoted Yoda, "Do or do not, there is no try." And that was addressed more at somebody who maybe has not started weathering their models or is just getting into it, and really talking about some ways that you can get started in that process. But I know there's also people who have been weathering their models and have been trying techniques. I hear from them a lot asking me, can I use this product or that product, or what do you suggest with this or that or the other? So I hear from them a lot. And I think that, you know, as with anything in this hobby, there is a continuum of where someone's at. There's the very beginning over here, perhaps, and as you move along in that, you become more comfortable in what you're doing and more familiar with techniques and products and things like that. And then at some point you get to an area where you feel like you're pretty good at executing what you're doing. You're fairly advanced in it, but you're always learning. This video is kind of going to talk about how to transition from those early stages to really making your weathering work for you and seeing it in a much more holistic fashion than just a bunch of rote steps. Now, just as in anything that you do in life, there is a need for those basic steps, you know. If you're going to be a pilot, they don't just stick you in the cockpit of a 737 and say, give it a shot. We got, 150 people in back. They're all hoping you do well. That's not the way it works. You start in a very small, light plane and you do study and you may do simulations, and then you get up and you fly this light plane around with the help of an instructor, and eventually you graduate to doing it on your own and going to larger and larger things. There's lots of things that are like that. So weathering your models is kind of the same way. You start off with some basic methods, some basic products, and you start seeing how those work and you build up on those. Now, in that process, there is a tendency that I've seen, and I did it myself when I first got started in weathering. There is a tendency to kind of see everything as, well, here's step 1, and here's step 2, and here's step 3, and here's step 4. And early on, I think those steps help because they help us define what we're doing and really focus on one aspect of modeling. But I think as we start to want more advanced finishes, that breaking out of those steps will really help with what I'm going to talk about later on with what I call your depth of finish. A few years ago, I pulled into my office parking lot like I do every morning to go to work, and there was a large piece of industrial equipment sitting there in the parking lot. But I took the opportunity to go over and examine it very closely, and I took a lot of photos. And it really helped me in terms of thinking about weathering by getting right up close and looking at how things worked. Now, the tractor, for lack of a better term, was basically used to, it looked like it had a big front loader thing on it and must have been used to carry stuff around a work site, pick things up, move them around. So it was fairly well maintained. You could see that a lot of the surfaces of the tractor, especially higher up, were still fairly clean paint. It looked fairly new. There were some rain streaks and things like that. But as I got in closer and started looking at the areas of the equipment that were actually doing the work in whatever it did around a construction site, those had a lot more paint damage. They had a lot more scratches and streaks and dirt and rust stains and fluid stains. And the more I started looking at it, the more I really, while I have always thought of this concept of depth of finish, When I looked at this tractor, it really hit home. Okay, this is real depth of finish here. So one of the things that I always like to urge people to do is when you're wanting to get started, when you're wanting to up your game in weathering, go look at weathering. And it doesn't have to be a piece of equipment. It can be walking down the street and seeing rust stains on the ground or on the side of a building. I talked about my office. There's a building near my office that I can look up at one side of it. It's probably about 4 or 5 stories, and there's a few windows on it. But there are streaks down this flat wall that faces where I come out every day. And I can see rust streaks and grime streaks and all sorts of things happening. And I can look at that and go, you know, that's the size of a big Mecca. That's what I would see if I were probably, you know, a football field away from it. Maybe not even that far, half a football field away from that building. Yet I can see these streaks and these stains very clearly. So it not only helps me see what weathering looks like on a large object, but it helps me understand the scale of it and what can be seen. Now, if you've weathered a few models, you're probably comfortable with skills like basic streaks, basic stains, adding chipping, adding some basic rust effects. So you have those individual skills down and you're comfortable with them. But I think taking it to another level is to say, okay, now how do I creatively combine these things? I no longer look at them as individual steps, but as elements of a greater whole. Now, a process that I do that helps me, and it may be helpful to you, is to define what I call a mission objective. I was in the military for a few years, and I still tend to think in military terms quite often. And I like to define in my head this mission objective in terms of something that's kind of narrative in a way. And by that I mean, I don't just think, okay, I want this to look heavily weathered. I may look at the model ahead of time and I'm trying to get a vision for what I want to do with it. And I'll think, okay, I want to finish this as if it were in a desert environment. And it has seen a lot of combat, and now maybe it hasn't, maybe it's moved further behind the lines and it's being repaired, or it's just got some downtime, and so there's some cleaning going on, but it's not all done. It's going to see some rain, it's going to see some dust, it had been in an area before where it rusted a lot. I'll just come up with this whole scenario. I'll even start thinking about personalization kind of stuff, you know, if I want to add that in. What would the pilot do with it? What would the crew chief do with it? All of these things that I relate, again, to real world experience, but I try and think, what is the story of this model? All right, so you're probably thinking, okay, you've made your case. We want to advance our weathering skills. What are some practical ways to do that? I'm glad you asked, because right here on this yellow notepad, I have them all written down. So I'll just hold them up to the screen and you can read them. Nah, I'm not going to do that. Now, these are not in any particular order that I would say, okay, you need to do things in this order. These are all just things to think about that you can add into your thinking if you're not already considering them, and then figure out where in the process they need to be in terms of order. One thing to keep in mind is to think both in scale and out of scale. And by that I mean, let's say you're building an object, a model that's 1/100th scale. Well, it helps if when you've observed a real world object, if you think, you know, okay, when I saw on that, I saw chipping that most of it was in real life maybe this big, you know, and then some of it was this big. And then there were a few places that were this big. And some of those overlapped and they were joined, but there weren't these giant areas of chipping or maybe rust. So when you're building something that's 1/100th scale, you want to look and see how does that translate? You know, those very tiny chips may not be seen at all. The chip that you most likely will see, the rusting that you most likely will see, will probably be about the size of your hand in scale. Or a really large area might be your head. And if you've got a really big head like me, maybe you have bigger chips. Now, there may be larger areas than that, but thinking in terms of what scale would this be in real life, how do the two compare, really helps in deciding what you're going to do on the model. Not just for chipping, for streaking, for staining, for how much things are visible. All of those things will help inform what you're to do. Now, I also mentioned thinking out of scale. Sometimes in building a scale model, to sell a notion of what we're doing, we may have to exaggerate some things. It may be out of scale, but if I'm wanting to sell the notion of some fuel staining or some fuel streaking happening, that if this were a real world object, might only be this wide, in 1/100th scale, you don't even see that. So you may have to make something wider when you're putting on those stains in order for it to be seen. So yes, think in scale, but at the same time, think about that kind of mission purpose that you have, and how does that fit into the overall scheme of things. And if you have to go out of scale a little bit to make that work, don't hesitate to do it. Another thing that you'll notice when you're looking at real-world equipment is differences in finish. There are going to be some areas that are glossy looking, there's going to be some areas that are satin looking, and there's going to be some areas that are matte looking. So when you're wanting to advance your weathering skills, don't necessarily think of everything in terms of, well, I have to put on a matte coat at the end, or I have to put on a satin coat. Quite often, I like to start when I'm doing the bulk of my weathering over a satin coat, because a lot of the weathering products are going to add their own matte effect over that. Others may add gloss effect. Towards the end of the process, I can go in with both gloss products, matte products, and satin products, and just paint in little areas of gloss streaking or patches or satin or matte. And by combining the types of finish that you have present on the model, it's going to make it look much more realistic. It doesn't all have to be one coherent coat of, say, matte finish, unless, of course, you want that. But by combining these different finishes, you're going to get something that's going to have a greater weight to it, because when our eye sees it, it relates it to real-world objects that we've seen that have the same types of variety of finish. And our brain assigns heaviness to it, weight to it, realism to it, that might not be there if it's just all one finish. Another thing that's really helped me is making use of different product types. I like using oils, but I also like using acrylics, and I'll use enamels from time to time. I like using pigments too. Making use of all of those is going to give you more flexibility than if you just look at one of those types and say, well, I'm just going to focus on this. Now, you can do it. I know a lot of modelers who they principally use almost exclusively oils or enamels. It works. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But I think when you start looking at the benefits and the disadvantages of each product as they relate to one another. In other words, I often like using acrylics to put in a larger area of stain because they dry real fast. They've got a certain way that they finish. They look a certain way. They have a certain opacity to them, and they can give me a large area of staining really quick that dries really fast. Then I can go in and I can put oils over that, or pigments, or oils and pigments, or enamels and pigments, or things like that to refine it. And those have different properties also. And by combining the two products, I take advantage of the strengths of both, so that it gives me something that's often greater than the sum of the two parts. Another thing that I've started taking advantage of over the years is this idea of just building up small stuff. When I was early on, when I was doing weathering, I tended to just say, okay, now I'm doing the chipping. And I would go in and just do all of this chipping. And then I would get done with it and I would go, whoa, that's way too much. And then I started looking at it and saying, okay, let me go in and do it really light on the most obvious places and just make it really very small. And then I might go in and do additional steps that aren't related to chipping over that. And then I'll go back and evaluate, well, I need to boost up the chipping here, or these later layers have covered it up in a few of these areas and I want to do it again and add some more. So adding multiple layers of things in small quantities allows you to not only see how it's developing, but it gives you a depth of finish. And by depth of finish, it doesn't look like just some Tamiya weathering powder smeared on a piece of plastic, but rather it looks again like what we see in the real world, that an object goes out the first time and it's clean. Say that tractor, it goes out and it's clean. Well, it gets to the work site and it does some work for the day and it gets a few chips and it gets some dirt on it and there may be a small fluid leak, and then they park it again. And then the next day it goes out and the same process is repeated. And then the next day, and then the next day. And eventually what you've got is layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of all of these things on top of each other. So by doing it in small amounts and not necessarily thinking in this strict step-by-step format, you're really building up something that's more like a real-world object, and that achieves depth of finish. Now, having said to do things in small steps, don't always be restrained unnecessarily. If there's a part of a model that you really want attention drawn to, then go ahead and bravely, bravely weather it. Put in a lot of chipping in that area. Put in a lot of staining or mud or all of those effects so that it kind of draws the eye to that particular area if that's something you want to feature. Again, if we think in terms of scale, sometimes things won't be seen. So painting things in these broad, bold strokes can really help increase the drama or sell the notion of what it is that you're trying to get across on the model. Now, one of the most important things I've learned in my weathering journey is to take advantage of opacity. I can take, let's say, some oils that are fairly transparent, that don't have a real high opacity, but the more I thin them, the more transparent they become. By taking advantage of opacity, you can build up layers of color until you get it just like you want it. It's a lot easier to build up layers of color than it is to take away some color. So learning to use opacity to sell the notion of something being stained or streaked, or there being subtle changes in the color across something, taking advantage of opacity is really going to help your weathering. And you can do that with oils, with enamels, with acrylics, even with pigments. It's all got to do with how much you thin it, how much you put on, how much you dilute it. Whatever you do to change that opacity, it's going to help you in building things up to get exactly the effect that you're wanting. Another process that I like to go through is, as I'm evaluating what I want to do on the model, I try to always remind myself to not get caught in what can be a trap of, well, I have to do this step first, and then this step, and then this step, and then this step, and then whatever happens, happens. By taking advantage of small applications of product, by taking advantage of opacity, by taking advantage of the properties of different types of products, and then doing those in a way that achieves the final objective. Because if we allow the process of the steps to dictate things, then we're going to kind of be at the mercy of whatever the order of those steps are. But if we think about the final objective that we're trying to hit, then we're going to control the steps and we're going to put them on not in a way that might be done across the rest of the model. Let's say you've got an area that you want to be highly rusted and a really big fuel stain on it. Well, the process that you go through to make that happen in one area may have nothing to do with the order of steps that you took across the rest of the model in general. The steps don't determine the outcome. The outcome determines the steps, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Now, another thing that I think is critical that I address in talking about this, as you're learning to weather, as I'm learning to weather, I'm always learning to weather. I never will reach the weathering. I'm always learning it. As you're doing it, there may be some things that come out not quite like you want. I'm not going to call them mistakes, because I really do believe, if you've ever seen the painter named Bob Ross, he talks about we don't make mistakes, we have happy accidents. Things that may seem like a mistake can be a learning experience, can be a way of saying, okay, how do I get around this? How do I make this work for me? I think one time somebody asked me what I thought was the biggest difference between a beginning modeler, an intermediate modeler, and advanced modeler, whatever you define that as. And I said, really, I think what distinguishes intermediate from advanced is their ability to recover from things that happened that were unintended. I think that's when you can start feeling like, okay, and of course everybody sees it a different way and everybody's somewhere along that spectrum. But I think when you start getting to what we like to term as more advanced, it's not so much about what can be accomplished, but what can be unaccomplished, so to speak. That when you do something, when you try something, and it just doesn't turn out like you want, you go, okay, how do I use this to my advantage? How do I add to this? How do I take away from this? How do I make this work and continue moving on? Because when you get to that step, you don't run into these things where you say, oh, I've ruined my model. You go, okay, now I have a new opportunity to learn, a new challenge. Now, I'm not talking about that, you know, if you've got your model on your desk and you reach up on a shelf and you spill an entire bottle of paint over it. Okay, there may not be any recovery from that. But don't be afraid when you're putting on weathering, when you're working through this process, that if something turns out like you don't want, don't panic, don't get mad about it, but figure out, okay, how do I make this work with the rest of it? Now, another thing that I would say in moving towards advanced weathering techniques is always be in learning mode. If you want to weather models, always look at models that show good weathering. Always look at real-world objects. Always look at the products that you have. Ask questions, see how people did it, practice on things. It's a constant learning process. I'm able to weather models fairly well, I think, but I know that there are a lot of things I want to be able to do better, and so I practice those. And I may pick 2 or 3 on every model to say, okay, I'm going to try and do this that I've not done before, or don't feel like I'm as well versed in it as I would like to be. So always be in growth mode. Now, the final thing that I'm going to just bring up briefly, and I've brought this up in other videos, so you may think, hey, I've heard that before from him. You have. But I think this is really important. I think you have to step back and view your work objectively. To look at it and go, yeah, here's where I did it 4 models ago, and here's where I'm doing it now, and I can see growth. But here's this real world thing that I was trying to emulate, and it's still not quite like I want. I need to refine it further. Now, having said that, I think the 2 biggest things that I've seen when you view your work objectively and you're thinking, how do I improve this? In my own work, the 2 biggest things that I've seen that help me progress in the next project is to say, okay, I need to be more restrained in the amount that I apply, and I need to be more willing to have less opacity and then build up from there. The more I've done that, the better the resulting finish has been. And I can then look at it and go, okay, yeah, I can see real improvement now. But looking at your work objectively, I think is absolutely critical. And if you don't, it can really hold you back. I hope this has given you some ideas to examine your process, examine where you are in your weathering, and then look at how can I grow it. And I hope that these steps have given you some things that are just a starter. It's not the end-all be-all. You're going to think of other things. You're going to hear other things from other people. File all of it away. All of those are tools in the toolkit. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you're still watching at this point. I'm always grateful for the folks who hang around till the very end. That just means a lot to me. So thank you if you're still watching. There is, of course, a subscribe link down over here. So if you want to hit that, I would be most grateful. Hit the little bell icon, and that'll let you know when I get a new video out. I'd also be very grateful if you would click on the little like button to give this video a thumbs up. And if you would take a moment to just drop a comment in here, just to let me know, hey, I watched it, you know, thanks a lot, goofy guy, whatever you want to say. Let me know some things that you do in your weathering that help you grow, or that you've seen others do. I always like reading those. I do read every comment, and I try to respond to every comment. So I appreciate that, and it does help me grow the channel, which is something I'm really trying to do. There's also links down below to all the social media that I'm on, to my blog, and of course there's a link to my Patreon campaign. Please click on that, take a look at what's offered there, and if you would like to support the work that I do through Patreon, I would be most grateful. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much for standing with me in this that I'm trying to do. You make it possible. Yeah, if it wasn't for Patreon, I would still model, but I wouldn't be able to do it at the pace that I do it, with the materials that I do it, and the equipment that I have, if it weren't for you. So you make this possible, and it is a blessing to me and my family. So thank you very much for your support. And as I always like to do, I'll leave you with one final thought. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye. What the heck did I write here? Ah, oh well. Take two.